also very angry. So I'm not an angry person. I didn't even know what anger felt like. For some reason, putting my face in front of the camera makes me upset. Fix that and then like, right, you put the video out. Now on Instagram, on all socials, Facebook, I started a Facebook group so we can share results and experiments, Dyers colorways, which I send out free every month in my newsletter. I share my dyeing process. What else? I'm Lori from Muffs Merino, www.muffs.co.nz. You can weigh your dye powder and place it right in the pot, or you can weigh your dye powder and place it in a cup and add water to it and stir, and your dye will be ready to use, and you can use up all of that dye. You do not need to make dye solutions. You might want to use dye solutions for your fiber dyeing if you're dyeing a lot of the same color all the time, or you may want to use dye solutions if you plan to mix dye colors together to make new colors. What is a dye solution? What is it? A dye solution is a pre-mixed liquid stored for later use. So it's going to be dye powder mixed with water, and that solution can be used to measure out amounts to dye yarn. A dye solution is made by dissolving dye powder in water. When making dye solutions, there's always a universal amount of dye to water that is consistent across places because the dye is a certain concentration. Dharma dye is a common dye brand to use, and it's a highly concentrated dye. It's a very economical dye. I really recommend using Dharma dyes for those reasons. The dye will go a very long way. Some dye brands may require twice the amount of dye to match up to the strength of another brand. The amount of dye required to make a dye solution is only 1 gram to 100 mils of water. Landscape dyes, for example, require 4 times as much to reach the same depth in shade as Dharma dyes. And so that is a little bit more costly, requires a lot more dye powder to achieve the same colors and shades. To keep things very simple, I recommend using 1 gram of dye to 100 ml of water. That could be 2 grams to 200 mils, or 4 grams to 400 mils, or 10 grams to 1000 mils. This is the same concentration no matter how much dye solution you are going to make. If I wanted to make a lot of dark colors, I would simply double my recipes. The only time I don't use the 1 gram to 100 ml is when I'm dyeing pastels and light colors, or sections of colorways that are light colored. It can be very challenging to measure small amounts of dye for small amounts of fiber in light colors on your weigh scale using the dye powder. I will create dye solutions and measure my amounts in mils from those dye solutions. It can be also difficult to measure small amounts of dye with the 1 gram plus 100 ml solution. To achieve minute amounts of dye for a very light pastel color on 1 gram of yarn, or say silk threads or whatever fiber you're working with, can be very challenging. This is when dye solutions come in very handy. You can make a diluted dye solution, which would be 0.1 gram of dye plus 100 ml of water, and this would be a diluted solution. I keep all my dye recipes the same and consistent. My dye recipes are based on 1 gram of dye plus 100 ml of water. Pre-mixing your dye solutions saves time, especially if you're pre-mixing dyes with colors you frequently work with. By creating a dye solution, you can measure pre-made dye recipe amounts from your solution. This will help you achieve consistent results in your dyeing. Dye solutions also allow you to easily measure amounts of dye instead of mixing a powder every single time. When you're dyeing your fiber, if you need a certain color, it may be convenient to take your dye solution and measure the amount or pour the amount that you require in mils and just place that onto your fiber instead of having to take out the dye powder, weigh it, and mix it every single time. Dye solutions can be handy for dyeing light shades, pastels, and small amounts of fiber. You can create a diluted dye solution, which will allow you to measure the small amounts you wouldn't be able to measure with a highly concentrated dye solution, or using dye powder alone. It can be very difficult to weigh tiny amounts of dye powder, even on a micro weigh scale. Storing your dye solutions in containers allows you to store those solutions over time and just use them whenever you need them, to have the colors on hand and ready to go. So how do you make dye solutions? It's very easy to make dye solutions. Dye solutions aren't dye recipes. Dye solutions are dissolving dye powder with water so that you have a mixture that is ready to use for your recipe. If you were to have a chocolate factory and you want to make a lot of chocolate, you may have a pre-mixed mixture of chocolate that you're going to store or you're going to pre-make, and then you're going to measure out the amounts of chocolate you need to fill your chocolate mold. So how do you make dye solutions? I like to have a micro weigh scale, and I will put a link of where to buy this micro weigh scale. I really love this weigh scale because I have gotten dye powder on it, in it, I've gotten water on it and in it, and it has just not failed me. 2 AAA batteries, and they last a very long time. I recommend, if you're a dyer, to have a micro weigh scale and a normal scale. I use my normal scale to weigh my fiber. I use a micro weigh scale to weigh all my dye. And it's just handy knowing that you have your micro weigh scale so you can dye the smallest amount possible. You will need is some little spoons, or 1 little spoon, just to scoop out your dye powder. I bought these spoons thinking that I'm going to measure out the dye powder with them, but in the end I decided that weighing your dye on a micro scale is a much more accurate way for consistent dye results. And it really depends how technical you want to get with it, because you could start your yarn shop and say, I'm going to use this amount for all of my colors, and I'm just going to scoop out this amount for each color every single time, and that would be quite consistent as well. If you are not very picky and particular and that's just the way your style is and you're going to run, then that's totally fine. You want to make dye recipes and be very particular about those recipes and achieve consistent results. That is a different style of dyeing, and you will definitely want to go with a micro weigh scale for that method. There are so many different methods that you can use to dye, and so it's just a matter of what your style is and how it works for you. The way I dye, it all needs to be very particular, written down so that I can find the recipe and I can just copy that recipe over again, have systems in place. I really love these containers because they have the measurements on them, and so I can make a 1000 ml dye solutions. These would be very handy if you're dyeing a lot of yarn and you want to make dye solutions. Just put the dye powder right inside the jug with boiling water, mix it up, and then I can add the rest of the water to the amount required. I also have these plastic measuring cups, and I recommend getting everything clear if you can, just so you can see the color, make sure it's right, you can see how high you are measuring. These are my smaller dye solution containers, and I would be using these today, but the reason I'm not going to use them today is because I'm just out of them, and so I'm going to use the big ones. Another reason I like these big containers and how wide they are is because I use syringes to measure out samples. When I make a dye recipe or when I go to dye color, I will often test that color depending on what I'm using it for, and I can quickly grab dye out of here with my tiny syringes. So I find having this wide open top very easy to measure recipes from. And you may require much larger jugs than this depending on how much yarn you're dyeing and how much color you're using. I only use 1 gram to 100 ml dye solutions for all my dye recipes, and that keeps everything consistent and straightforward. I'm going to make 3 dye solutions. I have Dharma dye Brilliant Yellow, Dharma dye Alpine Blue, and Dharma dye Kelly Green. So I'm going to weigh 1 gram on my micro weigh scale. Here's my micro weigh scale with some of my dye recipes, and I am just going to tear that. I'm just going to take my dye powder and place it in the container. I will just add some boiling water to that, and I don't want to go past 100 ml, and mix it around. I really love it because I can kind of just squish it around to get all that dye powder and make sure it's dissolved. So I normally have 2 containers. I will have one to get most of the dye off, and then I'll place it in the other one depending on the colors. Does it have 100 ml? It has 250. Oh my gosh, it doesn't have it. I have measured up to 100 mils. That is my Kelly Green dye solution ready to go. So now we have our Kelly Green 1 gram to 100 ml dye solution. So now I have my Alpine Blue. So I will measure 1 gram. Prefer to go over than under in our jug. And just give it a swirl first. Then I will add the rest of my mils. Tiered this, and I have the brilliant yellow. And you will notice as you begin to weigh out your dye powder that some dye powders require more dye to reach 1 grams than other dyes. They're made up of different compounds and metallics and metals. For example, this color seems like a lot of dye powder for 1 gram. If I'm unsure, just make sure that I tiered it properly. I noticed that the reds are quite heavy and the blues are quite heavy as well. Okay. There we have 1 gram of brilliant yellow. So there we have 1 gram plus 100 mils of water for each color. And we haven't made any dye recipes yet. Some of these colors require 2 grams of dye. And so I will need to make more dye solution to measure out 200 mils of dye solution or 2 grams. In the next video, I plan to use these dye solutions to calculate how much dye we need from these solutions to dye various amounts of fiber. I hope so far you're not confused, because making dye solutions and making dye recipes for your yarn and fiber is a separate topic. Making dye solutions is so handy just to have dye solutions ready to go. I want to come home from work and I decide I'm going to dye some yarn tonight and measure out the amount I need for my recipe, for my colorway, and then I can just pour it on the yarn. The exciting part about dye solutions is that it's quick and easy. You could spend your day in your dye studio making all kinds of dye solutions in very large jugs and having them all ready to go. And you could develop it further where you start mixing 2 colors together and you make new colors, and you would have dye solutions for those colors ready to go as well. I learned that some of the colors were more popular than others, and having those dye solutions on hand for those colors were going to be very, very handy. There is a place for dye solutions, and now I know that I will use dye solutions and have large jugs ready to go, ready to measure out if I ever decide to continue down that path. But since I'm only dyeing samples and I'm dyeing very random amounts of fiber to make colorways, I'm just going to continue using my dye powder. The green stuff on my face. I've gotten dye on my face. Use gloves if you're messy, like me. Use gloves. If I was running hard and I was working a yarn shop and I was, scooping that powder out, throwing it on the weigh scale, hard at it, like, I'd probably wear a mask. You know when to wear a mask. For example, when you put the dye powder in your container and you pour the hot water in, you can smell the chemical smell. I know these dyes are fairly safe. They're not edible though, so it is important to wear a mask, and I'm gonna say wear a mask because anything can happen. Chemicals aren't good for your body. Those black dye powders are very thick and you will smell the dye powder. It's gross. If you're working with it a lot and often, then you're gonna wanna wear a mask, and you're going to want to also put on some gloves. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as dye solution making can possibly be. So the exciting video comes next, and I'm going to show you how to calculate your amounts to make dye recipes for different fiber amounts, for colorways, for yarn samples, for dyeing fiber, for dyeing yarn. And once you get to know the process, once you get to know percentages and the same calculation over and over and over again, it will become second nature, it will become easy, and you just need to get past that first hump of using percentages and recording your results, recording your recipes, and using percentages. That's really all you need to know. Creating a system for yourself, having a system in place can also be very useful. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you haven't yet subscribed, hit that subscribe button for more tips coming your way. Don't forget to put lids on our dye solutions because obviously they're going to evaporate, they're going to dry up over time, and so you want to keep lids very airtight on your dye solutions. And we don't want to forget to label our dye solutions. I would label it with the color, and I would add 1 gram plus 100 ml water or 1% or whatever works for you.